Good morning. I imagine many of us love the story of David, King David from Scripture. There's so many different little pieces of it that we all think of when I say the name David, and it is a fascinating story. You open up the book of 2 Samuel where his story is found, and it opens up with him mourning over the death of the Lord's anointed, meaning Saul, but also the death of David's enemy. Saul had spent well over a decade, if not 2 decades, searching after David, trying to kill him, trying to kill the one who was going to replace him on the throne. You get to chapter 2 of 2 Samuel, and you have David becoming king, kind of. He partially became king because you've got part of the nation that is still going to be ruled by Ishbosheth, who is one of Saul's sons, who tries to take the throne of his father. And then you've got chapter 3, which tells of a civil war that happened there, and Abner gets killed. And then you've got chapter 4, which tells the story of Ishbosheth being killed. And it's not till chapter 5 that David officially becomes king over all of Israel. So here's what I find fascinating, is that in chapter 6, immediately, David's seemingly one of the first things that David does is he seeks to bring the ark to the capital. He wants to get the ark back into the center of the people where it belongs. The ark represents God. It represents God's presence. It represents God's approval. And he wants that back as the center of the people. And you know the story. They put it on a cart and they start carrying it along, and Uzzah reaches out to stabilize it because it starts tipping on the cart, because that was not the way God had commanded the ark to be moved. And of course, God strikes Uzzah dead, and there's a whole disaster that happens, and David grows fearful, and they leave the ark where it is for 3 months in a home nearby. And it's not until 3 months later that David finally gets the ark where it belongs, back to the tabernacle, back where it is supposed to dwell. The story is a beautiful story there of David being so excited. It says in verse 12, it was reported to King David, verse 13, when those carrying the ark of the Lord advanced 6 steps, he sacrificed an ox and a fatted calf. David was dancing with all of his might before the Lord, wearing a linen ephod. He and the whole house of Israel were bringing up the ark of the Lord with shouts and the sounds of ram's horns. There is incredible celebration as the ark is moved from one location back to his home. Michal, his wife, gets upset whenever she hears that he's dancing seemingly immodestly in front of the servant women. And I love David's response to her in verse 21. It was before the Lord who chose me over your father and his whole family to appoint me ruler over the Lord's people Israel. I will dance before the Lord, and I will dishonor myself and humble myself even more. David wasn't concerned about the people. He was concerned about bringing honor and glory and celebration into the presence of the Lord, despite his own humiliation. In the very next chapter, you have another story of David's love for God and his dedication, because he says there in verse 2, look, I am living in a cedar house while the ark of God sits inside tent curtains. And David desires to give the ark and to give God more honor, more glory. He wants to build not a tent for God's resting place or for God's presence to dwell. He wants to build a house for God. David wants God to have permanent residence among his people. I don't know if you've ever thought about worship in the first century. I mean, you look around us and we've got padded pews. Everything's kind of color coordinated, right? I mean, everything Got, different shades of brown and wood, and then the white walls and beautiful ceilings, and everything shaped so that the worship sounds of our singing will reverberate back down to us, and we will get to hear the beautiful voices. We even have, I don't know if you know this, 3 microphones around the auditorium that while we sing, we can turn them on, and our singing isn't just what we hear, but it's even given to us through the speaker system, which makes us sound even louder and better, right? It's nice and bright in here. We've got fans going to keep the air circulating. We're all dressed in nice clothes. We're all comfortable. Probably most of us ate breakfast this morning, those of us who have a habit of eating breakfast in the morning. We're comfortable. Things are good. Could you imagine going to worship at the tent? I mean, inside the tent, which is not where the common person would go, but inside the tent, a tent that was probably smaller than our foyer. I haven't measured the foyer, but based on measuring what the size of the tabernacle in the past, the tabernacle would have fit inside of our foyer. Maybe not height, but width and length. Not large. And it heavy curtains on posts. And so it would have been dark. It would have had a peculiar smell to it because there was a certain kind of incense that could only be made for the temple or tabernacle service. And so it would have had a particular smell to it, likely some sort of maybe covered floor, but possibly even dirt floors. We're not told much about the floors. So it would have been almost dark in there with a few little flames flickering, and it would have been smoky, and it would have smelled. And not only that, but you've got the sacrifices that are happening outside of the tabernacle, and so now you've got the smell of animal flesh burning and hair burning and just the unpleasantness that would have gone along with that. And you're expected as a common person to come to the tabernacle, and you were to be involved in some of the sacrifices where you had the blood and stuff sprinkled on you. But in other cases, you had to watch animals being slaughtered and their blood being drained out into cups and blood being used for different purposes. And you would have had to stand there. Stand. Not sit in padded pews. Stand. For some of the worship services, stand all day. I wonder how many of us would be so keen on worship in those circumstances. I mean, how many of us would have still said, that's the group I want to be a part of? It's in a tent, smells, it's hot, you got to stand the whole time, but that's worth it in order to give my God the honor he deserves, because that's the way David felt about worship. A couple of Psalms for us to read together. Psalm 95. Probably should put my screen on here. Psalm 95. Have it kind of small on the screen. I don't apologize for that. You have a Bible in front of you. Open it up. Psalm 95. And let's read it from there, right? Psalm 95. Now this one, we don't know that it comes from David. We're going to read 2 different Psalms. The next one does say that it comes from David, but listen to these words. Come, let us shout joyfully to the Lord. Shout triumphantly to the rock of our salvation. Let us enter his presence with thanksgiving. Let us shout triumphantly to him in song. For the Lord is a great God, a great King above all gods. The depths of the earth are in his hands, and the mountain peaks are his. The sea is his. He made it. His hands formed the dry land. Come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker, for he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture, the sheep under his care. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your heart as at Meribah on the day at Massah in the wilderness, where your fathers tested me. They tried me, though they had seen what I did. For 40 years I was disgusted with that generation. I said, they are a people whose hearts go astray, and yet they do not know my way. I swore in my anger, they will not enter my rest. So here's the thing, and I love this psalm because it creates a contrast. They're being called to worship, but they're also being reminded of what happened when you put your own comfort above worshiping the Lord. That's what happened at Meribah and Massah. They were scared, so they rejected God. They were scared that things were going to be difficult, and so they walked away from God. They refused to continue to bow before God, and God punished them for it. Psalm 122. Psalm 122. Here we got a psalm of David. And it says, I rejoiced with those who said to me, let us go to the house of the Lord. Our feet were standing within your gates, Jerusalem. Jerusalem, built as a city, should be solidly united, where the tribes, the Lord's tribes, go up and give thanks to the name of the Lord. This is an ordinance for Israel. There, thrones for judgment are placed, thrones of the house of David. Pray for the well-being of Jerusalem. May those who love you be secure. May there be peace within your walls, security within your fortresses. Because of my brothers and friends, I will say, may peace be in you. Because the house of the Lord our God, I will pursue your prosperity. Con already read for us Psalm 150, another psalm of praise, where they're being called together to worship, called together to come and bring all the tools of worship together so that they might bring great worship and praise to God. Hallelujah, they shout repeatedly in the psalm. You see, we are given an opportunity as God's people to come experience the best day of the week together. Camp for years for me has been labeled the best week of the year. And that is something that I hear repeatedly on the mouths of so many young people who come and experience camp, and so many adults who are involved at camp, where we come together and we are excited to come spend the best week of the year together. That's what today is. And every week, it's the best day of the week we have. And it's the best day of the week for many of the same reasons. We get to gather together with people who think like we think, who love God like we love God, who appreciate what God has done for us. We all share someone died. We talk about celebrating their life, right? Just recently we had Nadine's celebration of life. We wouldn't have called it celebration of her death, right? That just sounds awful. But for Jesus, call it that. Because Jesus' death and his give us hope. It gives us a common hope. It gives us a shared hope. And we get to come together one day a week and experience that together. That's what makes this the best day of the week. And so I wanted to spend just a couple of moments with you today discussing what it is that makes today the best day of the week. That's really my only point in today's lesson, that today is truly the best day of the week because we get to begin the week with God. That's what makes this day so good. If you go back, if I went back to the title screen, the little picture of the calendar that I have there that's kind of cut off on the bottom of your screen begins with Monday. You know how many calendars begin with Monday now? Like most calendars, weekly calendars you buy these days, they begin with Monday because that's our first work day. And it ends with Saturday, Sunday, oftentimes split in half. Not the way the week's designed. The week's designed to begin with Sunday. And that's the way it's been understood for centuries. The day begins with Sunday because the week begins with God. We get to gather together in the morning hours every single week and remember that we belong to God. Remember that God deserves our worship. Remember that it is by following God and doing things God's way that we will have good lives. And it's by His grace that we have hope. And so we begin the week with God. And that makes us a good day. We get to take a break from the world. We don't always do that. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've sat in worship and thought about everything I've got to do all week long. Right? I sit there and think about my to-do list. I've gotten in the habit of getting up early and working on my week's to-do list before I come. It's the last thing I do in my office on Sunday morning before I come because it helps get all of that out of my head so that I'm less distracted from my worship by a whole lot of me or a whole lot of the world and the concerns of the world. But we have the opportunity here when we gather together to gather together with people who are not antagonistic toward us, people who love us, people who share things with us, people who are also not a part of the world. We gather together, take a break from the trials and temptations and the difficulties of the world. That is repeatedly what I've heard from young people about what makes camp the best week of the year, is that it is the one week of the whole that they get to get away from their friends, get away from all the people who drag them down and who tempt them and are a constant source of difficulty in their life, and be with other people who are just like they are. We get that every single week, folks. We get that together. And so we can come together and talk about things that are better than this world. We don't always do that. We talk about the game. We talk about work. We talk about the difficulties of life. We talk about the things that have us down. We talk about the things we're struggling with. And there's nothing wrong with any of that. But I want to remind you that this is our opportunity to take a break from that. It's our opportunity to think about better things than this world has to offer us. It gives us the opportunity to focus on positive things only. Depending on your interpretation of Revelation, we have varying ideas of what the New Jerusalem is. This place that's described as a place of comfort and pleasure and good, positive things where there's no crying and no death and all of these bad things of this earth have gone away. But let me tell you, it doesn't matter whether your interpretation is that is heaven or that is the church. The church is a glimpse of what heaven is, right? And heaven is a place where all of those bad things cease to exist. Heaven is a place where we don't worry about death and dying and sickness and sorrow and despair. And so the church, as a glimpse of that, can be the same thing. A place where we can come and not worry about death because we all have hope. and not worry about sickness, because whether sickness we recover or not, it doesn't change our hope. And not worry about despair, because we have a God who loves us and cares for us and comforts us, and we have a people who care for us and love us and comfort us. And so it's a great thing, chance, an opportunity we have to just come be joyful and be so together. A place where we get to focus on God's redemption. God's redemption. I don't know about you, but I find that being in the world reminds me of our need for God's redemption. Being among of the value of God's redemption. And I would much rather tell on the values. I love that I get to have conversations that I will be in eternity with. I know shared the same love of God's redemption and reconciliation that I have. I get to come and we get to talk about all of the good that God has accomplished on our behalf. We don't have to think presently, right now, about all of the good still needing to be done. Now, I hope that's the way we approach the world. I hope we come here and we are refreshed in a way we can go out in the world still needs to be done and share the message that brings the same sort of hope and redemption to others. But here, I'm not worried about sharing that as much as I am honored to be able to share it with you. It allows me to focus on just how valuable God's work has been. Now I get to come here and worship a worthy God. David just led one of my all-time favorite songs. He led several of my all-time favorite songs this morning, actually. Be Still My Soul is one of them, and Only a Holy God is one of them. You know what I love about the song Only a Holy God? Is that it repeatedly tells me only God deserves my worship and my attention. Only God. He's it. He's what it's all about. And I come here with you and I say those words with you in unison. And we all together talk about how only a holy God deserves our worship. And we're all singing it. And one of the things I hate about pews is that I don't get to see all of your faces, which is one of the things I love about song leading, is that I do get to see all of your faces. We'll be honest. 95% of us, our faces don't change, but there are a few of us who wear our worship on our faces, and it is a glorious sight to behold. I love it because it reminds me what we're here doing. It reminds me that we're worshiping, that we're sharing message, this glorious reality with each other, that we are who we are because we have an amazing and awesome God. What a good thing that is to share. And that makes this the best day of the week. I get to gather with God's people, and that's a big deal. It's a big deal. It's a big deal because, like we talked about last week, we are family. Almost started singing that just now, by the way. So we are family. We are brothers and sisters. And there's just a specialness to sharing a relationship with somebody that you are so close to, that you are intimately involved with, that your lives are intertwined. That honestly, as we talked about last week, is more important than any other relationship. We to gather together with people who belong to God. if I'm not overselling this, we are all children of a king and children of the creator of the universe. We are children of God, and therefore we are gathered together with royalty. We are gathered together with the single most important people that have ever lived on earth. That's who you're in a room with right now. The most important people on earth. I think we need to make sure we're not letting that take a back seat to anything else. I get to pray with God's people. I get to pray with God's people when I'm here. And again, don't undersell this. We are a group of children of God who get to come before our Father and together share our concerns with Him with one voice. We get to all gather together and express together the things we need God to do in our lives in order to bring Him glory. And that's important. It's important to be able to do that. It's important to be able to value the fact that we have together an audience with the King. And He hears every word and every thought. This is the best day of the week because we are encouraged by belonging. Study after study after study has proven that just through the course of years, the number one need among the public people, among people in general, is a sense of belonging. What we're all looking for, but it's what we take for granted. We have it. We have that here. We belong to the same God, and we belong to one another. We don't question whether one of us belongs. We just accept one another, quirks and all, don't we? We all know each other well enough to go, yeah, that's kind of how Adam is. But we love him anyway. And if it were an issue of sin, I have no doubt that multiple of you would come to me and say, hey, Adam, I love you enough to help you do better. And if it's not an issue of sin, it's just one of those weird things that Adam does, y'all accept me for it. Because I belong here. You belong here. We belong together. And there's a certain encouragement that goes along with that. There's a certain joy that goes along with that. Together we get to be excited about the future. We get to be excited about the future. I've lived a good life. And I don't mean that meaning I'm good. I mean I've been blessed. I've been blessed in a lot of ways. I've been blessed beyond what many others have been blessed with. I get that. I understand that. But every single one of us knows that in the future, for those who belong to God, there are blessings unimaginable that God has prepared for us, according to Jesus in John 14, a dwelling place within the house of God, that we have the opportunity as God's people to go live together with our Father in His house. How do you not be excited about that? Like that. There's so much joy and enthusiasm and anticipation that goes along with believing I get to be in God's house one day. And we get to dwell on that and talk about that and imagine that together as God's people. But then we get to experience that same hope today. Because just like we get to go and be in the house of God one day, we in a sense get to be in the house of God now. Do you remember what David said back in 2 Samuel chapter 6? Chapter 7. 2 Samuel chapter 7, he looks at Nathan and he says, "Look, I am living in a cedar house while the ark of God sits inside tent curtains." He wanted to have the house of God now. And many of us know the rest of that story, that God did not allow David to build that house, but he allowed David to get everything prepared so that Solomon, his son, the next king, would be able to build that house. And when you look at the stories of how all that plays out, and Solomon goes and he dedicates this temple, and there's a whole chapter in there about the things that were said to dedicate this temple to God. It was all about being able to experience the presence of God now. And brothers and sisters, while we don't have a tent with incense and candles burning and a separate room for the ark of God, nor do we have a gold-plated building in which we can approach God, we have God dwelling in his church. That's what we have. We are the temple of God. We are that temple. Isn't that what 1 Corinthians 3 tells us? That we need to be cautious and be aware that as the temple of God, we are living correctly. We need to be the people who are doing the things that God expects us to do in order to be the place where God is willing to dwell. Verse 16 of 1 Corinthians 3, "Don't you yourself know that you are God's temple, and that the Spirit of God lives in you?" And so while we are excited about being in God's house one day and experiencing the presence of God on his throne and being able to truly understand exactly who God is and have no barriers between us and him, we as the church still get to experience that in some ways today. And when we gather together as God's church, we are gathering together in the presence of God like they did. We are getting to experience the best day of the week because we as the church get to be the temple together. This really is an extraordinary day that I think sometimes just becomes a day on the calendar. It becomes one more day to meet your responsibilities. It becomes one more opportunity to get up and go through your habits and survive the day for some of us and revel in the day for others of us. But it just becomes one more day. And I would encourage you, brothers and sisters, realize the value of this day. That as God's people, this can be the best day of every week. Not because necessarily of the way it makes us feel, but because of the opportunities that God has created this day with. That we have the opportunity to come together and experience the joy of belonging to him and belonging together. If you don't belong to him, then you don't belong to the family. And to be honest, if you don't belong to him, this is just any other day of the week. Because you can't experience the joy that comes from being part of what he has created. So I encourage you, if you're not a child of God, if you've not put him on in baptism, today's a good day to do that. Or maybe you need to learn a little more. Maybe you've still got some questions. You still have some reservations. You still have some things you're wrestling with a little bit. Let us help. Let us sit down with you and show passages of Scripture that will give you answers, that will help you have assurance before God and confidence in your salvation and belonging